In February of 1981, New York held a ticker tape parade for the 52 Iranian hostages that were taken at the U.S. Embassy. For one of those hostages, this ticker tape parade was being held in his home city. Today I want to break down for you what led to the U.S.-Iran hostage crisis and what it was like there through the eyes of this particular New Yorker. Viewer discretion is advised. Let's get into today's video. Barry Rosen was a Brooklyn boy. He was born in East New York. He lived just a couple blocks away from Ebbets Field, was devastated when the Brooklyn Dodgers left for the West Coast, and even went to college at Brooklyn College. When it came time for his graduate studies, he finally left his home borough and went to Syracuse University. In fact, getting up to central New York, it was his first time ever on an airplane. He went to school for public affairs and focused his studies on a Pakistani mullah, which is a person of Islamic nobility, and he hoped to one day visit Pakistan. After President Kennedy started the Peace Corps in 1961, Rosen applied, hoping that this would be his ticket to Pakistan. However, Pakistan was under military rule at the time, and so no opportunity really presented itself. That didn't mean that other countries didn't have openings, though, and in 1967, Rosen was offered the opportunity to go to Iran. He spent the next 3 months learning Farsi, which is the Persian language, and at the age of 23, Rosen took his second flight ever, this one to Tehran, which is the capital of Iran. With the Peace Corps, his duties were to teach English to police cadets and to kindergartners. In his spare time, he embraced the Iranian culture. He visited different historical sites, he read their poetry, and after 2 years, he finally completed his mission and he was sent back to New York. Rosen had this new fascination with Farsi and other languages of the area, and so he enrolled in a language studies program at Columbia University. One of Rosen's professors urged him to take a job at a company called Voice of America, which is this big international broadcasting company that produces content in nearly 50 different languages, and one of those languages was Uzbek, which Rosen also happened to be studying. Rosen felt this immense pressure to take this job because he had just gotten married, and they were looking to start a family. They wanted to have children. So he took the job and worked there for a total of 4 years. Now, he certainly made an impression with his boss at Voice of America, because that boss would go on to become the public affairs officer at the U.S. Embassy in Iran. And he was looking for a press attaché. Rosen was now being offered another job, this one in Iran, a country that he truly enjoyed living in, and this would be an amazing opportunity for him, so he ended up taking the job. Now, before we continue Barry Rosen's story, I do think it's important that you understand what the political climate was like in Iran. But I do also want to make sure that it's as easy to digest as possible. Throughout the Cold War, which is post-World War II up until 1991, the United States and the Soviet Union basically wanted to make sure that neither of the two countries got too powerful. One country of interest was Iran. Oil was discovered there at the beginning of the 20th century, and it was controlled by the British. However, in the early 1950s, Iran was trying to change that. The man who was pushing to make this happen was the Prime Minister of Iran, who was named Mohammad Mossadegh. Now, the British obviously hated this idea of Iran nationalizing their oil supply, so they turned to their friends, the United States, and said, "Hey, the Soviet Union, pretty close to Iran, isn't it? Do you want to help us maybe overthrow the prime minister? That way they don't fall into the hands of communism?" And the United States basically said, yes, we would like to do that. Now, Mossadegh's mentality is these other countries aren't really helping us in any way when they take our oil, so why shouldn't we nationalize? And then the West is thinking to themselves, if you're just going to pull away from us, that means you're probably joining the communist side, and we don't want that to happen. So the US and the UK aided locals in order to stage a coup and overthrow Mossadegh. They wanted to replace him with a Shah, which is basically a king. After these locals successfully overthrew Mossadegh, the United States and the UK put in place this new Shah. This was Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who was the son of the former Shah who had died during World War II. So basically from World War II up until this point, Iran had been without a Shah. Pahlavi was anti-communist, and he didn't care if other countries got rich off of their oil. However, the people of Iran hated this guy. The people who had staged the coup, they were the minority. The people of Iran actually really liked Mossadegh. This new Shah ruled with an iron fist. He was imprisoning and torturing people who thought differently than he did, but then he was also expanding on the transportation networks, and he was increasing people's personal wealth by a large amount. I'm not suggesting that one thing might cancel out the other, but hopefully it at least provides some perspective on different sides of the political spectrum. The millions of people who hated the Shah didn't point their anger at him. They pointed it at the British and the Americans. And when America kept giving the Shah money, he would rely on the Americans to stay in power. So the Iranian people, more or less, hated America. People protested for years, including one man named Ruhollah Khomeini, who was a big religious figure over in Iran with political aspirations. However, he was arrested and exiled. More on him in just a little bit. Shortly after all of this happens is when Rosen goes to Iran for the first time. The people of Iran hated the American government specifically, not volunteers that were trying to teach English to kindergartners. When Rosen was given the opportunity to go back to Iran, he listened to the words of President Carter, who said that the Shah was beloved by his country. Why would he think the president was lying to the American people? When Rosen went back to Iran the second time to go work at the US Embassy in Tehran, he realized things were much worse than he anticipated. The Shah had been in power for 25 years and the people had had it. In fact, these protests were so scary to the Shah that he actually imposed martial law and told the military that they could open fire on the demonstrators. And they did. They killed dozens of people. But this didn't stop the protesters. In fact, they learned that the Shah's health was in decline. Pahlavi was diagnosed with chronic lymphocytic leukemia, which is a form of cancer, and protesters started to suggest that this might be the time for revolution. And then on January 16, 1979, the Shah left the country and he never returned. With the Shah out of the country, Ruhollah Khomeini no longer had to hide in exile. So he came back to Iran and was welcomed back like a hero. Khomeini now held the high-ranking religious title of Ayatollah and was named as the supreme ruler of Iran. A provisional government was put in place with Khomeini at the helm, and his revolutionary Islamist movement promised a break from the past. Just 2 weeks after Khomeini's return, Iranian militants stormed the US Embassy. Extremists even opened fire on the embassy, and Barry Rosen was there. He was beaten, he was thrown against the wall. In fact, he was convinced that he was about to die. However, Khomeini's provisional government stepped in right before it started to get bloody. Everyone was cleared out of the US Embassy, and it would remain closed for weeks. People were even sent back to America, including Barry Rosen. When the embassy reopened in March, so about 2 months later, they gave people the option of whether they wanted to come back, and most people didn't. But that wasn't the case for Barry Rosen. He still felt like he had a job to do. Even though it was a terrifying spring and summer, he continued to do his work and pushed forward. But when autumn rolled around, the Shah entered the United States for the sake of getting medical care. And when the people of Iran found this out, oh, they were not happy. American flags were burned in the streets, along with effigies of President Carter, and Rosen could hear chants from outside of his office window that translated to "Death to America." Fast forward to November 4th, 1979, a rainy Sunday. Rosen attempted to do his work, but he couldn't help but look out the window. And what he saw was a group of students climbing the embassy walls and approaching the front door. These students pounded on the door, and before Rosen could stop his secretary, the doors flung open and these students stormed into the embassy, violently. They threw Rosen and the others down to the floor, they kicked him, they told him to get up and do what he was told. And then as Rosen was being led away, he turned to everybody and his staff and just said goodbye. He had no idea what was about to happen, but everyone was in tears. In fact, as he was being led away, he heard people pleading, I have a family, I don't want to die. All of these people had just become hostages. Rosen was then blindfolded and led through a crowd, and he didn't know it at the time, but this picture would be taken of him and would cycle through American news channels for quite some time. Rosen was brought to the kitchen of the ambassador's quarters, and there captors held guns to his head, ordering him to sign a confession that he was a spy or he'd be shot. And he was only given 10 seconds to decide his fate. As they counted down, Rosen tried to be strong, but when they reached 5, 4, 3, 2, he finally broke. Now, against all odds, 6 American diplomats escaped to the home of Canadian diplomat John Sheardown. The Canadian Prime Minister worked on a secret mission to deliver Canadian passports to these Americans in order to get them home. He was able to do so by producing a fake sci-fi film set in Iran. Sounds crazy, I know, and if you want the full story of that, feel free to go rent the 2012 Best Picture winner, Argo. As for the others, there's no anticipating how long this would last, and there was always that fear of being killed. Rosen was under the impression that they would not kill somebody if they were awake, so he tried to stay awake as long as he could. The captors played psychological games with all 66 of these hostages, often doing mock executions. They would hold guns up to their faces and pull the trigger, but no ammunition in the gun. They also controlled when they went to the bathroom and when they ate. Now, Iran was willing to give up the hostages, but only if the United States gave up the Shah. And by give up the Shah, I mean send him to Iran to be executed. They also wanted the US to apologize for their role in overthrowing Mossadegh, and money, obviously. Interestingly, the captors had a soft spot for the women and the African American men that they had captured. Over the next few weeks, these 5 women and 8 African American men were released from captivity. That means we're now down to 53 hostages, and one of them is still Barry Rosen. Rosen said that he wanted to die nearly every day that he was there. Several of the hostages even attempted suicide with no success. Then in 1980, the US attempted a rescue mission involving multiple aircrafts. Unfortunately, a sandstorm disabled one of the rescue helicopters, and then a second helicopter attempted to back up, but it did so into a refueling plane, and it caused this massive explosion that killed 8 service members. When news of this hit, the captors decided it would be best to divide up the hostages and send them to multiple locations. And so once again, Rosen was on the move, and he made quite a long journey to whatever his next destination was. His only clue as to where he was a bottle of milk that said Isfahan on it in Farsi, which is a city that was 250 miles south of where they just were. Rosen was given one cellmate, which was a guy named Dave Roeder, who was the embassy's Air Force attaché, and the two of them would share this windowless room for days, which turned into weeks, which turned into months. The only reading supplies that these two were given were the boating classifieds from the Washington Post. Now, as it turned out, Roeder already had a fascination with boats, so night after night, Roeder would pick a boat from the listing, and he would tell Rosen to close his eyes, and then he would narrate a boat trip for the two of them on Chesapeake Bay. They did this every single night that they were there. And then one day, without notice, Rosen and Roeder were loaded onto a truck and transported to Evin Prison in Tehran. This is a terrifying prison that Iran uses to torture and execute people who oppose their policies. The only positives that Rosen could take away from this place was it was slightly warmer there, and he was given 2 additional cellmates, so there were more people to talk to. But this room was tiny. The only way that the hostages were able to get any sort of exercise was to walk around the room. So what they would do is they would line up and they would just walk around the perimeter of the room for what was equivalent to several miles. On July 11th, 1980, one of the hostages was released. His name was Richard Queen, and he was released because of illness. He was 28 years old, but he was suffering from multiple sclerosis, or MS. He, like Rosen, was from New York, and he had been held hostage for 250 days to this point. The students who had taken these hostages didn't have much of a plan when it came to how to manage these prisoners. Medical attention was incredibly inadequate. Although none of the hostages were over the age of 65, some of them had severe health worries, and they weren't being fed properly, their meals were often late, and they were improvised. But the worst of it was the psychological component to it all. These remaining 52 men had no idea if they were ever going to be set free. It's not like they were told when people were being released. The only thing that kept Rosen pushing forward was the fact that he had a wife and 2 children waiting for him at home. And then came January 20th, 1981. The students came back into Rosen's cell and put blindfolds over him and his cellmates, and then they were marched out to a bus. This was a loud bus ride. The hostages have had enough at this point. They're yelling at the students, and the students are yelling back at them, and they're being spit on. Some of the hostages are thinking, if I'm being taken to my death, I hope it's quick. And then the bus came to a stop. One of the students came up to Rosen. They told him to get up. They led him off of the bus. He was standing somewhere on hard ground, and all he thought to himself was, where am I now? What's going to happen next? When his blindfold was removed, it was very bright. I mean, he had not spent a lot of time in the sunshine while he was in captivity, so his eyes needed time to adjust. But when they did, He saw where he was and he couldn't believe it. There was an Algerian Airlines plane sitting on a runway in front of him. They were at the airport. The students marched them onto the plane, and then the plane just sat there. And Rosen is thinking, what are we doing here? Am I being taken somewhere? Are we going to Africa for some reason? Why is the plane just sitting here? But the reason the plane hadn't moved was because they were waiting for Ronald Reagan to be sworn in as the next president of the United States. As it turned out, negotiations sped up in September of 1980 after Iraq invaded Iran. These men didn't know it yet, but a deal had been struck, and all 52 hostages were about to head home. Once President Reagan was sworn in, the plane took off, and all of these men felt this enormous weight lifted from their shoulders. But they didn't truly begin to celebrate until they were over Turkish airspace. While the other men uncorked champagne, Rosen sat there in his seat, looking at his hands, wondering, am I truly ready for freedom right now? The psychological damage that had been done to him would take years, even decades, to go away. These 52 hostages had been held in captivity for 444 days. The men were received at St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York, as well as Temple Emmanuel, and a ticker tape parade was being prepared in their honor. There was an ever-present yellow ribbon in attendance at that parade. The yellow ribbon had become somewhat of an American symbol during the hostage crisis. Rosen wore a dark pair of sunglasses during the parade. He sat next to his wife in a convertible as they went through the 2 million people who came to cheer him on, as well as the others, and his 2 children sat in a limousine in front of him. Here's his 4-year-old son, Alexander, waving out the window of the limousine. Rosen would have to reintegrate himself into his children's lives. He said it took a long time to get back into the rhythm of life. When he left, his daughter was just a baby, and now she's walking and talking. Rosen would actually meet one of his captors in 1998, 17 years after being released. The man apologized for what he did, but obviously the pain still lingers on for Rosen. I know that as of December 2022, 30 of those 52 hostages were still alive, with some of them still suffering that post-traumatic stress from that captivity even 40 years later. Some of them even still regularly meet up to get drinks together. So that's going to do it, folks. I remember when we were stuck inside during the pandemic and everyone was complaining that they were stuck with their books and their TVs and their laptops and their streaming services and video games. Let this story be a reminder that no matter how bad you think you have it, it's all about perspective. And with that, I'm going to say farewell on yet another video. Please make sure to like, comment, subscribe, all that good stuff. And until next time, deuces, kids.